Morning. This talk is about what I hope the future of research in reading will be. I realize that most research is incremental work and going just a bit farther than the field has gone before. Thus, a realistic, future-oriented talk on research has to be grounded in past work, and this one is. For as long as people have studied anything, though, there's been a part-whole dilemma, whether it makes more sense to focus on the whole or the constituent parts. So it is with reading research. There's been not lots, but a fair amount of recent research on whole classrooms and whole schools. But there's been much more research on the parts, the components, instructional components. So, because the whole classrooms and schools at work have been relatively understudied, I'm going to begin my talk by making the case emphatically that there's a need for a lot more research on whole educational settings that are effective, and potentially ones that are not very effective. As I do so, keep in mind that I will then follow with a discussion of the particular components. I won't resist commenting along the way about the wheat and the chaff in the marketplace of reading education, at least as I see it. It'll be clear that I still embrace research as I always have. If you've read any of the 3 editions of my most widely read book, the one on balanced teaching, you know that. What will also be obvious, though, is I don't embrace research uncritically. And I don't buy that all the research that is in the marketplace should be driving instruction. This point's important at this juncture because there are both researchers and policymakers who are willing to catapult reading practices that they favor that are not really very well grounded in research, not as well grounded as they could be. For those doing such catapulting, one message today is to do more research before foisting your perspective on the nation. Well, let's get started, thinking about the wholes first. So, the first part of this talk is research on the wholes, and we'll cover effective classrooms, effective schools, talk about some entire literacy programs, and entire language worlds of children. To be honest with you, I wasn't into reading research in the 70s and 80s nearly as deeply as I would be later in my career. I took the plunge completely in the early 1990s. As you might remember, I was doing research on comprehension instruction that was effective. We were doing it in real schools, and that put me in a lot of real school settings. For that reason, some people, including Carl Smith at ERIC, thought that I might be well positioned to serve as a referee, a discussant of sort, with respect to the whole language versus skills debate. As I read the pro-whole language and pro-skills literature in preparation for some of that debating, what I realized was that I wasn't seeing or reading about anything that much looked like what I actually saw in school. And things just didn't seem as wonderful in real schools we visited that were at the extremes, that were either whole language or skills, as their advocates made them sound. Most important insight I had, one with Ruth Ward McDonald, however, was that no one had gone out and studied effective schools or effective educational settings just because they were effective. They hadn't gone out and found classrooms that reading and writing was really pretty good and figured out what went on in them. Rather, they'd gone out looking for classrooms that were consistent with their perspective. Ruth and I would go out looking for such classrooms. We'd find them, and we were able to come up with a pretty good envisionment, first of all, what effective classrooms look like. I'll briefly summarize the remarkable consistency we found in those classrooms, a consistency that now has been replicated quite a few times by my group and others. There is a lot of skills instruction. Not uncommon to see as many as 20 skills an hour covered. often in context, often in response to student needs. Word recognition in particular is explicitly taught in the primary grades, with students instructed to sound out words, including using letter sound associations and all the phonics rules. Skills instruction, however, is strongly balanced with holistic composing and reading experiences. Students do compose a great deal. They read a great deal. Comprehension strategies are taught. There's a lot of teaching. Most of the time, the kids are actually doing academic stuff with the teacher either talking to the whole group or small groups or scaffolding individual children. Finally, there's high academic engagement in these classrooms. And a lot of that is because these teachers do everything they can to motivate kids to read and write and participate in the academics. It took Sarah Dozel and some of my other colleagues and me a whole book to catalog all the different motivational tactics that occur in an effective, engaging classroom. Now, as we did this work, we often found ourselves on effective classrooms. We often found ourselves in schools where we just knew next year it wasn't going to be as good for the kid who's now sitting in an effective classroom. We'd been peeking in rooms all over the school, and we knew that there were many schools that had a real mix. And some schools had an unfortunate high proportion of classrooms that were not very engaging and did not seem very effective. So that led us to ask ourselves, are there out there whole schools that manage to be good for the entire time the kid is in them, the entire elementary period? Almost all my work, as you know, has been in elementary and middle schools. Well, we decided to go looking for schools where that might be true. We're now in the process of studying our fourth such school. We are finding a great deal of consistency there, but I think the easiest way to talk about it is to tell you about one such school. Bennett Woods is an elementary school near Michigan State. What brought it to our attention is that in recent years it's produced higher performance on the state testing in reading and writing than other schools in our area. Typically 95% to 98% of the students in fourth grade pass the state reading test. Often 80 to 90%, actually always 80 to 90% or more pass the state writing test. These figures are way above the state averages, and they're higher than other schools in our neighborhoods. Lisa Raphael, Lindsay Moen, Lauren Fingerette, and I spent a semester in these schools. We were there for more than 250 hours of observations, complemented by interviews. We watched everything. So how does Bennett Woods do it? This is an academically focused school. The school days and weeks are highly routinized. There's a rigorous academic curriculum, frequent assessment, with assessments complete enough to inform the school well about what the kids need. The principal and all the teachers are also committed to a strong reading and writing curriculum, as well as a strong curriculum in general. And at the center of that is a commitment by these professionals to get more professional development, even if they have to pay for it themselves. The faculty and staff are very committed to preparing students for these tests, but not allow the tests to drive the curriculum. So there's attractive composing instruction that prepares the students well for the state test, but it's not teaching to the test. Even special teachers, the arts and music teachers, they coordinate their efforts. So there's art all over the school illustrating famous children's books. We saw lots of music being coordinated to themes in reading and writing. Now at the center of the curriculum, there's a lot of reading. Okay? These kids get massive experience with many, many books. They also get a lot of skills instruction, all the letter, sound, phonics, and word recognition skills. Vocabulary instruction goes on practically nonstop in the school. There's teaching and comprehension strategies. There is the writing instruction. And that writing instruction is mostly around a strong plan, draft, revise model with lots of revisions and accelerating demands across the year. Also, reading and writing's strongly connected to the content areas. So during science and social studies, there's lots and lots of reading and writing instruction and connection. This is also an exceptionally positive environment with many explicit attempts to motivate the students, from lots and lots of read-alouds to get them excited about particular books to lots and lots of efforts to increase in these kids' mind the value of literacy. There's little, the other side, there's very little negative, very little sanctioning of kids, nor need of it. It's much like the effective classrooms. 40 or more positive mechanisms being used every day, almost no negative mechanisms. Now, you should notice, of course, there are certainly similarities between the effective classrooms and the effective schools. Effective schools are filled with effective teachers, and they're very, very positive places. Okay, what this work in effective classrooms and schools did was to provide me with a vision of what excellent reading and writing instruction can be like in individual classrooms and across whole schools. This is not a small accomplishment. For example, reflect on the vision of outstanding classrooms for a moment. Is this consistent with the vision of the outstanding classroom that's being thrust on the nation, for instance, through NCLB? I'm certain many of you immediately recognize that NCLB never mentions reading of lots of literature or composing, which is at the center of effective environments. There's no concern with creating massively positive environments. And the central role of testing in NCLB contrasts greatly with its role in effective schools and classrooms. Yes, excellent teachers in schools prepare for students for tests, but tests are not driving the school or classroom. Now, this work, more than not being a small accomplishment, one person close to the National Reading Panel process informed me off the record that this work in effective classrooms that I did was on the minds of some members of the NRP as they did their work. They were determined this work would never see the light of print in NRP. You might recall that only experiments made it in the NRP report, despite the urgings by at least one panel member, Joanne Yatfin, that qualitative studies like the ones I did should be included. The one person close to the panel who chose to speak to me about this informed me that my work in particular on the nature of effective classrooms was particularly bothersome to some members of the panel because they felt it had such a potential to mislead. In 2006, my view is that the work on effective literacy instructional classrooms and schools should be leading much of the thinking about what should be done to improve reading education in this country. An hypothesis that definitely falls out of my work is that we could produce more, if we could produce more classrooms and schools like the effective ones we've observed, achievement in the nation would increase. It is time to find out if that's true. And the need to do such research is urgent. Why? In the decade that my colleagues and I studied effective schools, we did run into plenty of ineffective teachers. It's very hard to come up with an exact percentage, but certainly I can tell you most schools at least have a few teachers that you really can't even stand the thought that they're teaching kids. And in most schools, the majority of teachers could do their jobs better. It is time to find out if elementary teaching can be made much better. One obvious tactic is to develop professional development, and we need to do that. Another, though, is to recognize that one of the most important characteristics of an effective teacher and teachers in effective schools is they are seeking out such professional development. They're open to it because they know they need to get better. One of our really interesting findings over the years was ineffective teachers were much more certain to believe they were already good they do not need to learn more. So one possibility is that more than professional development, we may also have to try to sift out who is willing to grow and who is not, and use that as a dimension to decide who we want in teacher education. I'm as sure as I'm sitting here that good teachers believe they have to grow. Now, with respect to whole schools, I'm mightily impressed that the principal makes a huge difference, finding in my own work and in the classic work on effective schools. Principals go far in creating environments where literacy instruction is expected to be great, and they provide support so it can be great. Now, also as I've done my work in schools, I've encountered many principals who seem to be clueless as to what's going on with respect to literacy instruction. Many of them, in fact, one of the things that we've often noted when we've been in ineffective schools is principals are never down, these principals are never down the hall in the classrooms. Apologies for this cynical diversion, but it's on its way to this important point. We have to find out much, much more about principals who oversee effective schools and how they came to be effective. Then we need research on how to develop more such principles. So I've opened this talk on the future of research and reading with this case that we need to study effective literacy instructional environments more completely and see if we can create them and if that makes a difference. This is important work to do because we do have many classrooms in this nation. They're not as good as we'd like them to be. And so I think my first huge hope for research is that we are going to see lots and lots of work on how to develop more effective schools and classrooms, and then evaluating that work. Now, our federal government has recently been in the business of doing things that they think will create more effective schools. You might have thought that the first step that they would do would be actually to look to see what goes on in an effective educational environment, like I did and some other people. Just seems logical. That's not what they did. What they did was surveyed the literature on various instructional components and said, throw all the ones that we think work and we favor theoretically into a package of a school, and that ought to do the job. Phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension strategies, with basically no mention of anything else in their perspective. Is there an effective classroom in the nation so heavily focused on these skills that nothing else even deserves mention? I doubt it. Indeed, I'm not certain that I've ever encountered a classroom that is consistent with what is in the mind's eye of those who put together NCLB, or at least not an effective classroom. Reed Lyon, have you ever been in a classroom that is so consistent with the NCLB envisionment? If you have been, any chance there might be a little something else going on, like literature and writing? Without work describing effective environments, you're not going to be able to build one. I can't even imagine having the chutzpah to recommend to schools that they follow the NCLB formula based on the evidence that they read and pointed to. At the very least, those who have forced on the nation an approach that forces the teaching of the phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension, at the very least, they should evaluate their approach. And recall that this is a group that vociferously makes the case that evaluations to be credible, should be true experiments. So where is the true experiment on the NCLB approach, which is most completely represented by Reading First? It does not exist, and it's not coming. Rather, the best the government can offer is what is called a regression discontinuity analysis. This study could tell us something if nothing besides Reading First and NCLB had been happening in schools with respect to literacy when the study was being done. Of course, as you all know, literacy standards have been changing across the nation at the same time Reading First has swept the nation. Okay? This thing is not going to be interpretable. I think we should demand a true experimental evaluation of the Reading First intervention in the immediate future. And if the government cannot provide it, their demands to move schools in the direction of their five-factor model should fall on deaf ears until they have produced data, until they have produced the kinds of scientific evidence that they are demanding of so many others. Now, shame on all the rest of us if we do not accelerate our work to attempt to create more effective educational environments and classrooms based on what we've known and I talked about earlier. And shame on us as we do that if we don't evaluate their achievement. And finally, shame on us if we don't evaluate the environments we create relative to alternatives like Reading First. That's the only way we're going to find out which of these environments really make the most sense and have the most impact. All right, I want to say a few words about whole reading programs. An important reality of American schooling is many children experience whole reading programs published by Houghton Mifflin, Harcourt, McGraw-Hill, and others. Many of these contemporary programs have done all they can within the constraints of a published curriculum to incorporate evidence-based instruction so they can be sold in California and Texas and across the NCLB impacted nation. They include the 5 components. All of them go much farther. They include literature, they include writing, and they connect to science and social studies. They have to go farther because the state standards demand they do. So if you're going to sell them, they have to be. Now, given that there are many children experiencing years of such instruction, you might think that we know whether such programs work and how much they work. The bottom line is that we don't know much. I think we need to make a priority of evaluating these programs well to determine what these programs teach and whether students experiencing such programs become more literate or different literate than children who experience other forms of instruction. Now, as I make this recommendation in the context of an IRA research conference, I realize that my comments occur in a potentially hostile environment. After all, there have been prominent discussions in the Reading Research Quarterly about whether program evaluation should even be considered research, with some members, quite a few members, thinking it should not be research. I disagree, as did the editors of the journal as well, if you looked at their remarks. Many IRA members seem concerned about potential conflicts of interest by creators of programs if they also serve as evaluators, especially if they stand to benefit financially from the program. As I reflect on that concern, I'm aware that most interventions are first evaluated by the people who invented them. Science has a natural corrective if the developer of an intervention tests it in a way that produces 2 positive evaluations. When an investigator presents experimental or other data claiming effectiveness for an intervention, that's an invitation, one often taken to do additional research on the intervention. I think we should be encouraging the developers of interventions to test them, report their tests in the literature, and be confident that there will be follow-up data that will confirm and challenge the conclusions that come out of the initial evaluations. One analogy I've heard is that asking reading program publishers to evaluate their products is like asking the drug companies to evaluate theirs. Folks, a centerpiece of drug research is drug company conducted and sponsored research. There would not have been nearly the progress in the development and evaluation of drugs without that support. I think it's perfectly appropriate to ask publishers to conduct good evaluations as possible and to pay for those evaluations and other evaluations. As I make that call, I also think it's appropriate for the profession to establish professional standards for such evaluations, as well as for reporting and archiving them. If done well, such work will invite others beside the program producers to participate in the program evaluation process, and in doing so, lead to increased understanding about how such programs work, including how they might be refined to work better. Given the nation's history of using such programs, research aimed at improving them seems to be a moral imperative, for such programs are going to touch the lives of many children if history indeed predicts the future. Finally, on this section on wholes, I want to look at and talk to you a little bit about the child's language world. It's been known for a long time that from the earliest days of life, some kids are in more communicatively advantaged environments than others. Their parents talk to them more, a lot more. And it makes a difference. These kids' language development is more certain and rapid during the preschool years. And in fact, their language development during the preschool years predicts how they will do in literacy. The Hart and Risley study is one that lots of people know about, where preschoolers were studied for more than 2 years, and then they were followed up as they went into the elementary years. Now, there have been actually 3 or 4 other studies that provide bits and pieces that are in sync with Hart and Risley. Now, of course, cause and effect can't be inferred from something like a Hart and Risley study. After all, there are alternative explanations. For instance, the social class mattered in Hart and Risley. Lower class kids didn't get as much language as more advantaged children. So this was a correlational situation. All right. Now, what I'm going to propose is we actually now need to do experiments on what it really would mean to massively improve the language world of children. Yes, we have studies like Grover Whitehurst's work on storybook reading that shows short-term interventions, parents learning how to read storybooks with their kids and how to talk with kids as they read storybooks. We have short-term interventions that increase language. The big question is, can we massively change the child's environment? Can we work very hard to get the parents talking more? Can we get them in preschools that help them? Can we rally other institutional settings? We need to take seriously the possibility that if we massively changed the language environment of children, we could massively change their language and literacy outcomes. Now, this is an ambitious proposal. That said, we've got to find a way to that ambition. The bottom line is, if you look at something like Craig Ramey's work in the 1990s, to the extent that we have studied long-term intervention, it does improve outcomes with children. We need more such research that looks at the impact of massive interventions, particularly directed at language, on children, with those interventions lasting for years, and the outcomes traced for years. My concluding comments on the wholes. I'm certain there are policymakers who are hearing or reading this address and simply bristling, believing that even if the work I have called for were carried out, the cost of the whole interventions that would promote literacy would be too great in their view. A meta message is that as we do research to discover the sufficient conditions to produce better literacy outcomes, we may find that producing better outcomes is going to be very expensive, that much is going to be required. Now, another way of thinking about this is a bright future, the country, is going to be expensive. A better world may require that those of us who are advantaged are going to have to put more of our dollars towards educating other people's children. So, that's the first part of the talk on the wholes. Now, and my little statement here about being expensive. Keep that part in mind. Now we'll talk about research on the parts. Most research on reading and reading education is more modest in scope than the research I've called for so far. Most of it is on parts of reading instruction. I want to talk about what I think are some of the most important component hypotheses that are around. The first one has to do with the whole skills versus holistic instruction question, which I think is the wrong question. The skills first versus whole language reading war of the 90s was fiercely contended. Although I think my own work on identifying balanced classrooms, they balance skills and holistic literacy experiences, went far in making the case that either extreme was missing the mark. The extremes still persist. Now, my own work on balance, there's been an interesting set of studies recently that really reinforces the perspective that an excellent teacher balances instruction in another way than just the skills and the holistic, kind of undifferentiated. What they do is some kids get more skills and other kids get more holistic instruction. And what Fred Morrison has found, and Connie Jewell too, is that for kids who enter grade 1 with weaker skills, skills emphasis instruction gives them the best outcome for grade 1. Those children who enter grade 1 with more skills, more holistic instruction gives them a better outcome. Wow. The potential interaction between entering grade 1 reading ability and instruction deserves a lot of follow-up, for it's very powerful evidence against one size fits all. And if this interaction is consistently replicable, there should be great impetus to develop much more differentiated beginning reading instruction. Now, one particularly important thing to do will be to develop the teachers who can do this. And the reason that's important is I think the nation is committed to having kids mixed by ability in classrooms. You know, you could say, okay, you've got a really good skills teacher, so we'll give her kids who need skills instruction, which are the weaker kids. And we've got a really good holistic teacher, we'll give her kids who would benefit from that. The problem with that is you end up with tracking. The only way you're going to be able to avoid the tracking issue and also get the kids the differentiated instruction they need is that teachers really learn how to be much more balanced, particularly with respect to skills versus holistic instruction. IRA this week will be recognizing the importance of the Morrison work on the interaction, with that group receiving the Dina Feidelson Award later in the week. Okay, the second area, second component, fluency and the practice hypothesis. Students have to be able to do more than sound out words. They've got to read them fluently. We don't know much about how to do that, how to get kids to be fluent readers. More positively, people like Tim Razinski and some others have done a great job of assembling whole volumes of practices that skilled educators think work. The National Reading Panel provided some insight about guided reading and repeated reading. Although I like Steve Stahl's reanalysis of their work a little better, where he made the case it wasn't repeated reading, it was just total amount of reading that predicted fluency. Now, practicing reading seems to matter. All right? That's what you do get on the National Reading Panel when you look at that guided reading stuff. That said, the National Reading Panel had a lot of trouble with some ideas about practice. They were most critical about the USSR and drop everything and read models. They couldn't identify enough experiments evaluating them. Unfortunately, that got interpreted in some circles to mean these are not defensible practices. What they were was not very well studied or extensively studied. We need to take a look at practice broadly, not just USSR and DEER, but reading practice of all kinds. For more than a century, across a huge range of tasks, if practice doesn't make perfect, it makes better and faster. Okay? It also, practice, in addition to making better and faster, should increase vocabulary and knowledge development if the texts are high quality. It gives kids a chance to practice their strategies. It gives them an opportunity to begin to get in a worthwhile habit. So, I want to see a lot more work on practice. Now, before ending this comment on fluency, I want to emphasize one other thing. It's distressing to me that speed of reading is so being emphasized in current discussions of fluency. Millions of kids are being tested with this Dibbles measure, especially the oral reading measure. Some of you know about a study I did with children reading Dibbles passages, followed by immediate recall of the passages. Right after the reading, they could only recall, right after reading, 15% of the ideas in the text they read. Okay? Dibbles looked to us to be the ultimate case of word calling. Fast word calling, but word calling. I should add that as someone who did spend some time in his career studying really skilled readers, I'm acutely aware that excellent reading often is anything but fast. So for instance, when you all read a professional article, oftentimes you read it quite slowly. You make predictions and you react to it. You go back and reread. Some things you really read very, very slowly so you can make sure you know what is in the text. So kind of just from a face validity perspective, this whole fast reading thing doesn't make much sense compared to what we see when really good readers read and report on what they read. Now, as this work on practice and fluency proceeds, there does have to be some real hard thinking about the measurement of fluency and get us beyond Dibbles. Yes, good readers can read quickly if they need to, but more important in the fluency thing is you've got to be accessing meaning as you read the words and constructing meaning not just of words but of phrases, sentences, paragraphs. Fluency involves much more than word recognition, which is what is emphasized in Dibbles. It involves meaning making in a number of ways. This week at the conference, the new Samuels and Farstrip book on fluency is going to be available. I urge you to get the book and study it, reflect hard on the ideas in it, and I hope some of you will do some research on fluency. The essays in that volume give me hope that there's better work ahead than the work we've had so far. I guess I'll just close telling you that I think it's irresponsible of anyone in the name of evidence-based practice to suggest children should be reading less. Okay? We should be doing everything we can to get kids to read more, including figuring out how you can get them to really engage during USSR and DEER and see what difference that makes, rather than simply indicting these practices, which mirror a skill we want kids to have. We want kids to be able to silently read and get something out of it. We need to figure out how we can get kids to practice that and learn how to do that well and study that. Point 3, developing children's vocabulary. I've said a lot about teaching vocabulary in my career. As I reflect on all the work, I keep coming back to the fact that most vocabulary learned in context. We learn them in conversation or as we're reading text. So although I applaud people like Andy B. Miller, who's figuring out what words kids need to know at each grade level, and thus is trying to change reading curricula so they teach the words that kids most need, I don't think most vocabulary are going to be learned through instruction. And I think we have to keep that in mind. Now, I'm going to offer a new hypothesis about how you might get a big bump in vocabulary. And it comes out of my work in effective schools. One of the things that we have seen in effective classrooms and effective schools is that these places flood kids with vocabulary. They have them doing lots of reading and worthwhile texts. When they're doing those, say during a read aloud in class, an unfamiliar word comes up, teachers stop and comment on it. Maybe it goes up on a word wall, vocabulary word wall. The kids, as a whole class is reading a book, they will be held responsible for novel vocabulary, and those will be pointed out to them. In social studies and science units, there's always lots and lots of vocabulary. Vocabulary flooding is a way of life in effective classrooms. I think we need to do some true experiments where we evaluate whether such vocabulary flooding makes a difference, first in learning vocabulary, and then with respect to reading more broadly conceived. Does it produce reading achievement and reading comprehension gains? This is quite a different hypothesis. Probably the most prominent hypothesis in vocabulary instruction right now is to focus on a few words and teach them very well. This is focus on a lot of words and teach them. Give kids hints. Make sure they're encountering words and provide them with some understanding of what they mean. Hold them to some accountability. That kind of work needs to get done. All right, building conceptual knowledge. Ever since the NRP report, whenever Richard Anderson or David Pearson has been in the audience, I've jokingly asked them during my talk, did it tick you off that all that work that your Illinois Center conducted on the impact of knowledge and comprehension, that the NRP never mentioned it in their report? Of course, despite the fact that the case that prior knowledge is strongly associated with comprehension is overwhelming, the work on knowledge effects and comprehension was not carried out in true experiments, studies in which readers were randomly assigned in conditions, with some readers then acquiring relevant knowledge and others not. In such a research design, it could be determined whether knowledge is actually causal in impacting subsequent reading. Although I find it quite a stretch to attempt to explain the many knowledge effects demonstrated in the reading literature as anything but causal, I recognize the logical possibility that they could be due to some third factors. As I write this, reading and writing, however, are demanding much more of the school day, including parts of the day that traditionally have gone for content instruction and knowledge-based building. So, the only way that we're going to have social studies and science is that they're combined with reading and writing. And reading educators are on board with that. In fact, as you know, there are a variety of hypotheses around that such synergy, such conjunction of literacy teaching and content teaching will lead to many positive effects. And literacy people definitely have great confidence that kids can learn a lot from reading books. So if you read Jean Craig George's Julie and the Wolves, you can learn about Alaska, Native Americans, and survival of wolves. All topics that elementary kids need to know about. Okay, given the many opportunities for kids to read books that can build knowledge in areas like social studies and science, my colleagues and I have begun a series of studies where we look at just how much knowledge is acquired from reading novels and informational text. Katie Hilden and Lauren Fingerette are currently assessing this with me. They are making these assessments with respect to books that actually happen in the kids' schools. For each classroom we study, we go in and we actually work around a book these kids would have experienced anyway. We have come up with a design that is very much a true experimental design that permits us to estimate how much knowledge is acquired between subjects and how much knowledge is acquired within a person as a function of reading an excellent book. I suspect our first studies will find out about short-term knowledge shifts. The eventual goal is to find out about long-term knowledge shifts, how the knowledge shifts impact achievement if they do. I suspect there's going to be work here to take both Katie and Lauren to tenure. I hope others will follow the lead of my group on this. I think we need to figure out what we do to build kids' knowledge and what difference it makes. Now, suppose we find that kids acquire a lot of content knowledge from reading books. If we do, that is a serious indictment of any approach that would only favor phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension strategies. Okay, the next component, comprehension strategies instruction. I was there at the beginning of comprehension strategy instructional research, and I witnessed it all. And in 2000, I wrote sort of an historical overview, pointing out that there had been lots of studies of individual strategies, and in recent years, people had been studying clusters of strategies. Being articulated together. Now, so I thought, when I wrote that in 2000, nobody would turn the clock back and focus again on the individual strategies. They would focus on teaching kids a small set of strategies. Prediction, questioning, seeking clarification, summarizing. Maybe add imagery. Okay. Unfortunately, there was one group in 2000 that didn't pay much attention to my historical perspective. That was the National Reading Panel. What they did in their report was to basically look at every individual strategy that was validated, and that was the centerpiece of the report. These are the strategies, if you teach them individually to kids, improve their comprehension. Well, they were not the only ones not paying attention. We would see in about 2000 several different books for professional development come about with respect to comprehension. One of which is, hugely popular. It's hard to go into a classroom without seeing it. And those books also emphasize the teaching of individual strategies. Those books tended to have every kind of strategy that was ever validated. All of our work that had come up with the idea and validated the idea that if you teach kids a small repertoire of strategies, teach them to use them well, all of that was lost. Now, as I reflect on it, one of the things I can't help but notice is there's not much comprehension instruction going on in schools. I think we need to restart the research in comprehension instruction with a goal of getting more of it in schools. Now, when I say restart the research in comprehension instruction, that's because since 2000, if you look in the journals, there's been darn little research on this topic. It's almost as if the National Reading Panel report stopped such research in its tracks. And to some extent, I think it might have. This lack of attention can't continue. Now, a centerpiece of that, which another part of the National Reading Panel report hinted at, is that the most important component to getting comprehension instruction done well in schools is probably professional development. There has been research in the last 5 or 6 years making very clear, however, most recently Katie Hilden and I did a study, but Jeanette Klingner's done some work and some others, that such professional development is anything but easy. And in fact, if you go back to some of my work with Pam Eldoneri in the 90s, I would argue it'll probably take a year for a teacher to learn how to teach a small repertoire of strategies to her classroom so that she feels comfortable with it. So, I think we need to start doing research on professional development that might get teachers up to speed and pretty much pick up where we were at in 2000 rather than continue simply not to do anything. Now, as is the case with effective teaching in general, I'm not confident every teacher can become a comprehension strategies teacher. Even so, I have reason to believe that many could become much better than they are. The reading series I co-developed requires in every lesson that teachers model and explain and scaffold use of a small repertoire of comprehension strategies. Now, admittedly, this is not an ideal way to develop comprehension strategies instruction teachers, although it is a way that needs to be evaluated more carefully. I know of enough teachers who have used the program who learned a whole lot about how to be comprehension instructors from going through the lessons. So that gives me confidence that it is possible to dent teachers. We need to study very hard, denting them some more. Okay, finally in components, testing as a stimulus for reading achievement. Testing is a centerpiece of current educational policy, one that's at the heart of the No Child Left Behind, and publicly, openly embraced by President Bush and Secretary Spellings. One justification is that testing can inform educators about who needs additional instruction and even provide guidance about the particular type of instruction the children need. The assumption is that testing can ultimately produce improved achievement. The only problem is that testing does not seem to do that when we've looked, except with respect to the particular test used, probably a practice effect. All right, Mr. President and Secretary Spellings, if you are as evidence-based and as committed to experimentation as a gold standard as you have claimed so often, it is time to put testing to an experimental test. It is easy to imagine a true experiment in which children either receive all the testing that the federal and state governments want children to receive, or they do not. After a year or two in such an experiment, using other measures of reading besides the tests these kids have been taking, if testing does not promote reading achievement, that is, they're not reading better than kids in the controls who weren't so tested, we need to rethink whether it makes sense to be testing so many kids. We really need this experiment. If testing does not produce achievement, it's time to dispense with it and use the money for other educational inputs, for example, instruction and materials. Just so no one misses my drift here, I think it is high time to call the government on their policy with respect to testing. This is a very, very expensive policy in terms of dollars and opportunity costs. Every minute spent testing is a minute not spent instructing. And every minute spent preparing for testing, and there are many such minutes across this land every day, is a minute not spent instructing something else. Then there's a very good reason to believe that the harm goes even farther, with testing potentially contributing to behaviors that really undermine school achievement, including some analyses suggesting that it leverages some kids to drop out. The most constructive way to call the government on their policy is to do telling research true experimental research, and then use the results to leverage for better policies in the future. Of course, if testing does in fact improve achievement, you want to embrace it more, perhaps. At least you're not going to have as good a case for throwing it out, but we need to do the experiments. And based on the correlational data, I am not sanguine that we're going to see a huge increase in achievement from testing. Now, I can't comment on the government and testing without saying at least a few more words about dibbles. I already mentioned briefly one of the results from my studies of dibbles, which basically confirmed that dibbles is revealing about reading speeding when comprehension is low. So if you're interested in knowing about reading speed with low comprehension and memory of text, dibbles is a great measure. I want to comment on another aspect of dibbles, however. Dibbles proponents make the case for it as a dipstick measure, a quick indication of whether the child is making progress in reading. Now, when I heard this description, it led me to expect quite a bit from dibbles. After all, the height of the oil in my dipstick in my Honda correlates very highly with the actual volume of oil in the engine. Moreover, assuming the engine has just been turned off, the impurities in the drops of oil in the dipstick are very representative of the impurities in the oil in the crankcase. If the height of the oil in the dipstick is low, I can be certain that I should add oil. If the oil in the dipstick is dirty, I can be certain I should change oil. Not so with dibbles. In my own work, dibbles oral reading at grade 3 only predicted 20% of the variance on a more comprehension reading test. If you go to the Dibbles website and read the predictive studies archive there, in the very best cases, dibbles only predicts 50% of the variance with respect to predicting more comprehensive reading performance. What that means is that dibbles often flags children as at risk who will do just fine on the comprehensive measure. It also means that it signals that there are problems when in fact none exist. Okay? Dibbles oral reading is a lousy dipstick. Dibbles does not have the reliability of a Honda. Maybe it's a Yugo. When the entire body of research on dibbles is read, the only reasonable conclusion is that this is not a completely validated test. But here's what really irks me. A claim is often made that dibbles can be used to guide instruction. If you read the dibbles manual, what you'll find, however, that there's absolutely no guidance at all about what should be instructed for children to do better on dibbles or become better readers if dibbles flags them as at risk for reading failure. The administration wraps itself in claims of being evidence-based, research-based. Nobody who's really respectful of evidence would recommend a measure such as dibbles as a dipstick measure. Educators should demand evidence that administering dibbles improves reading performance broadly measured before agreeing to continue administering the assessment. Again, the hypothesis that dibbles administration can produce data that impacts teaching so as to improve student achievement is easily testable in a true experiment and must be tested if a case is to be made that dibbles should be prominent in reading education decision making. Basically, I'm saying the government needs to do the experiments they demand of everybody else. Finally, before departing this subsection on testing, I must fulfill a promise that I made to Richard Anderson. To meet that promise, I'm going to ask you to read, or listen to me read, and reflect on a poem, Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light, like a color slide, or press an ear against its hive. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out, or walk inside the poem's room and feel the walls for a light switch. I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. But all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with a rope and torture a confession out of it. They begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. Okay, now I'm going to test your comprehension on the meaning of the poem. Select the best answer on this multiple choice item. The poem Introduction to Poetry means A, there's one best meaning to a poem. B, poems can be read and appreciated by animals, including mice. Poems can be read at the beach. Only stupid people think poems with one meaning have one meaning that can be tapped with a multiple choice item. What Anderson wanted me to tell you is that progress in reading, and especially reading comprehension, is going to be severely handicapped by continuing to rely on multiple choice testing. As I usually do, I agree with Professor Anderson on this point. There, in fact, is a great deal of new thinking emerging about comprehension assessment, with this an active area of research, an area of research that I hope expands and leads to new thinking about how to measure comprehension. At present, testing probably is doing much harm. For example, prompting children and others to think that a Billy Collins poem could have only one meaning. This is tied to a very long, outdated theory of interpretation. Those of you who read Louise Rosenblatt's work know that. I close by stating simply that testing, especially standardized testing, is not what it needs to be if it is to be helpful to educators. I also close by reflecting on the teaching of very effective teachers, something I've been doing for more than a decade. I've never once observed an effective teacher use standardized test data in her or his decision making. I've seen effective schools do it to identify students in need of help, but I've never seen a school use the subscale scores of comprehension reading assessments to tailor instructional decision making, relying much more on clinical impressions and informal reading assessments to do so. As research on testing proceeds, there needs to be a lot of attention to the development of assessments that are truly helpful to educators. So helpful that effective educators will recognize they should use the data produced by the test. I know that as I made my closing point in this section on parts, that many of you will be bristling, recognizing that the current environment testing is being used to judge educators as part of an approach to educational improvement intended to weed out ineffective teachers and schools based on test scores. Well, my response is that if testing is to continue for such a purpose, there needs to be scientific study that testing so used in fact does lead to better student outcomes. In fact, that could be tested scientifically in decidedly true experiments. And if the current administration were truly evidence-based, they would be testing it in such experiments. I see no sign, however, that this administration truly has an evidence-based perspective with respect to testing, and I truly believe that in the absence of such an evidence base, a very good case can be made for pulling back on testing considerably. I could go on for hours about the testing mess, but I'll end now. So my closing comments for today's address. This talk started with a reflection on wholes and parts. I then made the case that we very much need to expand research on the nature of effective classrooms and schools, but more importantly, we need to figure out how to create these classrooms and schools as part of the evaluation. As I talked about whole classrooms, curricula, language worlds, and schools, inevitably I had to talk about parts. Given the limits of the human mind, it is the only way to conceptualize the complex in many ways. It is also a good way to think about the wholes, because reading educators and researchers are more experienced at focusing on parts, creating them, evaluating them, and improving them. The back end of the talk focused on some studies of parts that need to be done, and soon. Of course, as this work is done, the hope is that many educators will fold these components into whole classrooms. I'm very confident that the future of schooling will be better if we come to understand better how to differentiate instruction. For example, providing more phonics to students who will benefit most from it, as well as more holistic instruction to students who will benefit from it. Reading education will improve dramatically if better ways are found to improve fluency and vocabulary. Additional research and learning from literature and information texts has the potential to inform teachers about how to increase kids' world knowledge from experience. And finally, personally, I'm most excited by the possibility of getting comprehension strategies instruction restarted. Now, let's say we find out about some terrific instructional components. How do we find time to fit them in? One way might be to eliminate testing if it doesn't prove to be promoting achievement. All that time spent on test prep. The work on parts I have proposed this morning has great potential for transforming whole educational worlds. I'm going to do my best to be part of this work, and I urge all of you to think hard about how you can contribute. Thank you so much.